peace, love and protest signs. But what if the peace movements of the West weren't as innocent as they seemed? Behind the marches, the slogans and the chants for disarmament, was there a hidden hand, a quiet influence from the East shaping the voice of the West? Today we dive into one of the Cold War's most controversial questions. Did the Soviet Union manipulate Western peace movements to serve its own agenda? Get ready for a journey through espionage, ideology, and the fine line between peace and propaganda. To understand how the USSR infiltrated peace movements, we must first grasp the nature of the Cold War, a conflict that shaped every aspect of global life for nearly half a century. The Cold War was not a conventional war. It had no formal declarations, no clear battlefields. Instead, it unfolded as a prolonged geopolitical struggle between two superpowers with diametrically opposed worldviews: the democratic capitalist West, led by the United States, and the authoritarian communist East, dominated by the Soviet Union. While nuclear arms and espionage grabbed headlines, the Cold War was just as intensively fought in the shadows. Through psychological warfare, cultural subversion, propaganda, and the manipulation of public opinion. This was a war of perception, where influencing a journalist or a student activist could have the same impact as moving troops on a map. The Soviet understood this better than most. In Marxist-Leninist doctrine, political warfare was not a complement to military strategy, it was the strategy. The USSR believed in what is called the correlation of forces, a global equation balancing not just missiles and tanks, but media control, ideological adherence, and the political will of populations. This meant that the home fronts of NATO countries, schools, churches, labor unions, universities, were battlefields in their own right. And if those institutions could be infiltrated or nudged toward pacifism, anti-Americanism, or nuclear disarmament, then the USSR could shift the global balance of power without firing a shot. To wage this ideological war, the Soviets created an extensive apparatus dedicated to active measures, a term that included everything, from disinformation and front organizations to covert influence campaigns targeting foreign media. Western peace movements, passionate, often decentralized and emotionally driven, presented ideal targets for such operations. To a KGB officer, these groups were ripe for ideological capture. By cloaking its manipulation in a language or morality, the USSR could turn democratic societies against themselves. As a nuclear arms race intensified in the 1950s through the 1980s, public anxiety in the West reached new heights. Ordinary people feared annihilation. They organized, they marched, they protested. But while many did this out of sincere conviction, the Soviets saw a different picture. Behind banners of doves and slogans of hope, Moscow saw weapons of influence, activists who could be quietly redirected, radicalized, and funded in ways that would fracture NATO unity, discredit Western defense strategies, and ultimately bring the West to its knees. And the most powerful part? Most of those being used never even knew it. The Soviet Union's propaganda roots stretch back to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, when Lenin established the Department for Agitation and Propaganda, called Agitprop. Agitprop was a centralized propaganda machine designed to control public opinion and spread communist ideology, both domestically and internationally. During the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 and 1921, Soviet propaganda portrayed their invasion as a liberation rather than a conquest, influencing Western intellectuals to question their own governments. Though militarily defeated at Warsaw, the Soviets realized that ideological influence could be more powerful than weapons. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Soviet propaganda expanded, infiltrating Western labor unions, student movements, and intellectual cycles. The USSR mastered political influence operations and front organizations which disguised Soviet agendas behind local peace and human rights groups. By fostering distrust of Western governments and amplifying fears of nuclear war, Soviet propaganda planted the seeds for large-scale peace movements that unwittingly advanced Soviet geopolitical aims. The 1960s and 70s were fertile ground for idealism. Across Europe and North America, a new generation rejected the militarism of their parents and embraced countercultural values. They protested the Vietnam War, marched for civil rights, and demanded nuclear disarmament. Yet this wave of idealism didn't go unnoticed. In Moscow, KGB analysts saw not a threat, but an opening. The Soviet strategy for infiltrating Western peace movements was methodical. First came intelligence gathering. The KGB, along with satellite services from East Germany, Stasi, and Czechoslovakia, STB, compiled detailed psychological profiles on activists, scholars, politicians, and journalists. They tracked who attended anti-nuclear demonstrations, who published pacifist editorials, who led teach-ins or organized university protests. Targets were then classified into three categories: unwitting agents, ideological allies, and conscious collaborators. The most useful were often the first. Unwitting agents believed they were fighting for peace, but unknowingly echoed Moscow's lines. These individuals gave the campaigns credibility. They were genuine, passionate, and above all, believable. Then came the ideological allies, often Marxist or socialist sympathizers. They were more willing to coordinate messaging or attend international peace conferences sponsored by Soviet fronts like the World Peace Council. While they may not have taken direct orders, they operated in ideological sync with Soviet interests. The most prized, however, were conscious collaborators, recruited agents who received covert funding, instructions, and occasionally training. These operatives acted as conduits for Soviet money, organizers of protests, and facilitators of disinformation. Front organizations were crucial. Groups like the aforementioned World Peace Council, the International Organization of Journalists, and the Christian Peace Conference were created to serve dual purposes: spreading pro-Soviet narratives under the guise of humanitarian concern and gathering intelligence. These groups sponsored international summits, issued position papers, and passed resolutions condemning NATO militarism, all while remaining silent on Soviet invasions of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or Afghanistan. In order to obscure their true origins, these organizations recruited respected Western figures like priests, professors, poets, and pacifists to act as figureheads. These individuals were often unaware of the covert funding or political manipulation occurring behind the scenes. To the outside world, they appeared to be leading authentic grassroots movements. In truth, the scripts were written in Moscow. One revealing case came from the East German intelligence called Stasi. The East German intelligence routinely funneled money into the West German peace movement, particularly targeting church-based anti-nuclear groups. In return, they received intelligence on NATO plans, troop movements, and even personal details about Bundestag politicians. A similar pattern occurred in Britain, where the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, became a major force in the 1980s anti-nuclear protests. Though the majority of CND activists were sincere, the classified documents later showed that Soviet operatives monitored the group closely and occasionally funneled support through indirect channels. The irony is inescapable. Movements demanding peace, autonomy, and transparency were at times unwittingly serving the strategic objectives of a totalitarian regime that crushed dissent, invaded neighbors, and maintained the most formidable nuclear arsenal on Earth. While Soviet operatives worked tirelessly behind the scenes, their success hinged on something far more subtle and far more powerful than covert funding or espionage: the complicity and often naivete of Western institutions tasked with shaping public understanding. Chief among those were the media and academia, two pillars of influence in democratic societies that the USSR expertly exploited. Let's begin with the media. In an open society, the press is not just a source of information, it's a gatekeeper of perception. Soviet strategists understood that influencing even a small number of sympathetic journalists could have exponential ripple effects. These weren't always agents on the KGB payroll. More often, they were left-leaning intellectuals, anti-war reporters, or idealists frustrated by Western foreign policy. By subtly feeding these journalist stories, sometimes true, sometimes exaggerated, often distorted, the USSR planted seeds of doubt. Through front organizations, press briefings, and carefully curated peace conferences, Soviet proxies offered scoops that framed NATO as the aggressor, portrayed Western arms manufacturers as war profiteers, and painted Kremlin as a misunderstood peace seeker surrounded by hostile capitalist powers. Some Western journalists were unwittingly manipulated. Others simply echoed narratives that aligned with their ideological leanings. As a result, Soviet propaganda often bypassed filters altogether. It entered Western discourse organically, through respected newspapers, magazines, and public broadcasters. Consider how media coverage often framed the nuclear arms race. Soviet deployments like the SS-20 intermediate-range missiles were presented as reactive or defensive. NATO deployments, such as the Pershing II missiles on the other hand, were depicted as escalatory and reckless. The Kremlin's double standard was rarely exposed. Instead, the moral burden fell on almost exclusively on the West. At times, Soviet disinformation campaigns were direct. In the 1980s, Operation Infection, run by the KGB, planted the false story that the US had invented HIV/AIDS as a biological weapon. The story first appeared in the obscure pro-Soviet Indian newspapers before being picked up by leftist European outlets. Eventually, it reached major Western media and became part of the global conversation, a textbook case of active measures, succeeding beyond Moscow's expectations. But if media shaped the moment, academia shaped the minds. Universities are crucibles of ideology. They mold future leaders, set intellectual trends, and define what is considered legitimate discourse. From the 1960s onward, many Western campuses became hotbeds of radical critique towards capitalism, the military-industrial complex, and Western imperialism. While much of this critique was sincere and occasionally well-funded, the Soviets saw an opening. Soviet agents didn't need to infiltrate every university. Instead, they focused on cultivating key professors, researchers, and student leaders. Some were approached through front groups offering travel stipends to peace conferences in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union. Conferences designed to present the USSR as a rational, peace-loving counterbalance to Western aggression. Others were engaged ideologically. Soviet-backed publishers translated and distributed Marxist text across Western campuses. Sympathetic academics were invited to collaborate on anti-militarism research, often funded through foundations linked to Soviet front organizations. Certain departments, especially in the fields like political science, sociology, or cultural studies became echo chambers where anti-Western sentiment was not only tolerated but valorized. Maybe this reminds you something that we are witnessing today in the universities. Well, anyway, this dynamic had lasting effects. Curricula shifted subtly. Soviet atrocities, the Gulag, the Holodomor, the invasion of Hungary or Czechoslovakia were downplayed or omitted altogether. In contrast, American missteps, Vietnam, Chile, CIA coups were highlighted and dissected at length. The resulting asymmetry created a generation of students more likely to distrust their own governments than to question the motivation of a regime that banned free speech and crushed dissent. Perhaps the most striking feature of this infiltration was how invisible it was. There were no party badges or propaganda posters. There was no need. Once ideological subversion took root, Western institutions did the work themselves, amplifying Soviet narratives in the name of academic rigor or journalistic objectivity. And when skeptics raised alarms, when defectors like Yuri Bezmenov or figures like Vladimir Bukovsky warned that Western minds were being manipulated, they were often being dismissed as paranoid, reactionary, or relics of a bygone era. Ironically, it was those who pointed out the propaganda who were labeled propagandists. This was the Soviet Union's greatest triumph, not merely influencing public opinion, but embedding its worldview within the very systems meant to safeguard truth. By the time the Cold War neared its end, Moscow's talking points echoed through the lecture halls, editorial pages, and protest chants across the democratic world. Not by force, not by threat, but by narrative.